And you may begin. Ah, oh yes, you must have all the ear scratches.
Oh, yeah.
All right, so okay. So does everybody want to like introduce themselves?
Sure. I can start if nobody cares. Hi, welcome to the romance panel. I'm Stephanie Cranford. I've been reading and writing romance for a very long time, 20 years, because I am very old. And you can find me at stephaniecranford.net. I have a novella published like 3 weeks ago, literally. But more importantly, this is my dog, Freddie. He is a lab mix. He is 11. And apparently he's joining us for the panel. Oh, if I stop, he will bonk my headset off. So anyway, we've got other panelists in here.
Cool.
Hi, I'm May Margaret. Firstly, Stephanie, congratulations on publishing. So this is a pen name of mine. I haven't published yet. I am currently in the final draft of a historical romance with the aim of self-publishing.
Cool. Gray, you want to introduce yourself?
Oh right, I gotta do that. So yeah, my my pen name is Ty S. Gray. I've been writing since about 2019, off and on. I just now started in romance about 2 years ago. I have a published book. It's called Wolf and Hunter. I have one coming out hopefully this year, and I know right now I'm self-pub, but I'm kind of hoping to eventually break into traditional publishing. Eventually, I don't know yet.
Yeah, that's cool. All right, thank you so much. Okay, we'll jump into the questions. So, what are you want to talk about the romance place in the publishing world? I'm fairly certain it's fairly big, but you want to touch on like where it is and kind of thing?
Sure. I'll start. You all can jump in when you have something interesting to say. As Blue mentioned, publishing is romance is basically the biggest chunk of publishing. Regardless of how often it does and doesn't show up on bestseller lists and all that other stuff, generally speaking, the number one, a lot of the sales in romance have historically come from places that they don't count in a lot of like bestseller counting things. Like they used to sell so many romance novels just straight out of like grocery stores because that's where historically women read them, would go, and they'd in fact be there and shopping and they just pick one up. And but nowadays, what with the advent of self-publishing, romance is still the biggest because self-publishing romance is just absolutely exploded after about 2013, I think, which was when there was a particular series that came out and like sold millions in 1 year, and it was ridiculous. And I'm not referring to 50 Shades of Grey, actually. For once, that with self-publishing, there was the Beyond series by Kate Roca that just absolutely broke a whole bunch of self-publishing records. So that's a little bit of the like near-term history of romance and publishing. Does anybody else have any comments on?
Yeah, I was going to say another huge area when you're looking at the self-publishing is the Kindle books. A lot of the audience are subscribed to Kindle Unlimited, and they just devour books far quicker than I can ever read. So yeah, so yeah, it's absolutely the market share from YA all the way up, and obviously we're going to talk about things like different genres within romance, and we can talk about the heat levels in romance. But I think because romance is such a huge, has so many subgenres in itself anyway, it kind of lends itself to being so big.
Yeah, that's an important thing to point out. There's so many subgenres of romance. Like there's 8 of us in this call, I guess, and all of us could read romance, and we could conceivably read, hundreds of books a year and never actually overlap.
Yeah. Yeah, like I said, I write historical romance, which is a very, it's a big niche within romance, but it's very different from contemporary romance or rom-com or romantasy. So yeah.
I've never heard that term before. Romantasy. Is that like fantasy romance?
It's
Yeah.
it's a really recent portmanteau. I'm not surprised you haven't heard it before.
Oh, which is weird because that's actually what I've been doing recently. So I'm surprised I've never heard that term before.
So I might be wrong, correct me if I'm wrong, but my understanding of the term is that it's capital R romance set in a fantasy world rather than fantasy being a subplot of a rather than romance being a subplot of a fantasy book. Because obviously you can have romance as a subplot of books as well.
I think
That's exactly what I'm doing.
yeah, I think it's a little more loosey-goosey than that. Some big names that are generally considered romantasy would be like Sarah J. Maas and Rebecca Yarros. So they tend to, at this exact time, if you call yourself romantasy, they're going to expect like big drama.
Yes.
Big drama in the story. But obviously, like there's the term fantasy romance, so romance in a fantasy setting, or even just fantasy with a whole lot of romance in it, or romantic fantasy, or whatever you want to call it, has been around for forever. That's
Yeah.
kind of like, you could argue that a lot of the old Disney fairy tale movies, like Sleeping Beauty and Cinderella, I know they're like specifically they're fairy tales, but they also have the aspects of fantasy and romance to them. So
Yeah, exactly.
So this is something that's it's definitely not new.
So, going with that, bouncing off that one, could you maybe define maybe some of the genre expectations for romance? Then there's so many different subclasses, I realize, but overall, what would you say?
I think Gray wanted to take this one.
I mean, I can
Right.
do it. I can, but like everyone can have a say in it. I just like this particular topic, honestly. But jump in if you have anything else to add.
I just didn't want to start off every question because it seems
You're the one on camera, of course. So.
Yeah. The one thing that there used to be an organization, I mean, there still kind of is, but they're basically defunct, called the Romance Writers of America. And they were very influential for a long time. And one of the things they did was they put forth a definition of romance, which is still the one that most of us use today, which is that a romance is any story with a concentration on the love story, and it has to contain a happily ever after or a happy for now.
Yeah.
So at the end of that volume, the couple, like, for example, if you're writing a trilogy and they don't get together until the last book, that's perfectly fine. You can still call yourself romance, genre romance specifically, if they don't get together until the end. However, if they just don't get together at the end of the last book, you in the old days, like a traditional publisher just wouldn't pick you up because they're like, that's great, but it's not actually romance. And nowadays, if you're self-publishing, they'll be like, yeah, that's great, but that's actually just, an action story with romance elements or something.
Yeah, there's an expectation for mainly for the happily ever after. Like people want to see the main couple like get together, and when it doesn't happen, people might just end up dropping, or they just might leave a bad review, or just they're not happy with that. because there is an expectation when you read romance. Like, I want this character and this character. I want them to get together, and if they don't, I'm going to be mad about it. And that's kind of a thing that happens even in non-romance specific genres. People will kind of think about these characters they want to see a romantic relationship build with. So you always have that expectation for happily ever after or happy for now.
Yeah, and I think that means that there's a lot of work out there which technically isn't romance, even if it appears to be. I'm trying to remember that film. Set in Hollywood. It's a musical.
La La Land?
Yes, thank you.
Yeah, that might be it.
Not technically a romance because they don't get together at the end.
Yeah, and also if one of the two leads, the two people who should get together, if one of them dies before the end, that's a tragedy. That's not a romance.
Yeah.
It's again, all of these books are. If you want to read books in which there is a strong love story but someone dies at the end because you really like Nicholas Sparks or something like that, that is absolutely fine. Those are great books. They are not genre romance.
Yes.
If you try to call something like that genre romance, one of two things are going to happen. People will politely correct you. Or if you go in with the like personal theory that you're the one person who somehow realized that they can do this thing, which is write someone who dies at the end, a la Romeo and Juliet, which is a story from like the 1400s. And I know the Shakespeare play was from 1590s or whatever, but the story predated Shakespeare by quite a bit. If you're the person who's like, I'm gonna come in and I'm gonna make a romance where they die at the end, that is not a romance. You are not innovative. You're not special. Sorry. you're just you're doing one of those things where you're trying to disrupt the thing, but you're doing it by disrespecting the thing. And I'm not going to read it. Other people who are fine with reading, I'm going to pick on Nicholas Sparks just because I literally can't think of anyone else. But there are people who write romantic books where people die at the end. They're not romances, but they're extremely popular. So go write yourself a not romance.
I think it's about your expectations when you pick it up. For me, if I pick up a it's a historical romance. It's advertised as a historical romance. You've got the Regency era cover and all of that. My expectation is they're going to get together at the end, and if they don't, if something bad happens, I've been missold. Whereas if it's a tragedy like Romeo and Juliet, things, if they say a Romeo and Juliet inspired, or what's coming at the end, so you're not missold that.
Yes.
Yeah, exactly.
That having been said, even in the world of the RWA, they had these awards called the Rita Awards for many years that were fairly influential, but one of the categories they had was like one of them was romantic suspense, which generally speaking does end up with the two people getting together at the end, but you like, it could have a plot like Die Hard or something, and then separate from that, sometimes they would like there was a category that was something like fiction with strong romantic elements. So we're not just here to talk about literally genre romance today, but we can also talk about what Ty said, fiction with strong romantic elements.
Yeah.
That would be basically would be romantic subplot.
Yes.
Subplots are usually pretty good. Like they're everywhere. Like they're things like from Harry Potter to even most recently My Hero Academia, which that was a fun conversation to have.
Yes.
But yeah, there are romantic subplots in basically everything. And
you could be more flexible with a romantic subplot. If you're writing a sci-fi and you have a romantic subplot, then they don't necessarily have to be together at the end, because you're not selling it as this is a romance. But if you're saying this is a romance, capital R, romance in space, that's completely different. That is the expectation of the happily ever after or happily for now. So you can see the kind of difference between, is it your main plot and your setting is the other genre, or is it a subplot of a different setting or different genre?
There's someone, and I have it open, who I can't remember who did Pages and Platforms has something they call the 7 essential story types. And basically you're going to combine any of them together, right? But so even when you're writing a love story, you're almost always going to have a supporting story type that's usually, you know, action or something. So if you think of or vindication or something like that. So for example, if you're watching like a rom-com, like a movie that is intended to be a romantic comedy, and I literally cannot think of a single one off the top of my head. I guess Pretty Woman is what I'll go with. But that has in theory a romance plot, even though the ending is a little questionable. And it's also got like a vindication subplot where it turns out that, you know, this young woman can in fact be turned into a Pygmalion sort of situation. You know what I mean? So even within romance novels, there's always a strong subplot or a secondary plot. I'm not even going to call it a subplot because it is the through line of what's happening in the book.
Yeah, you need some sort of conflict. So I also write screenplays, and I enjoy rom-coms with that. So I'm thinking of like some of them from like the 90s and early 2000s, like While You Were Sleeping, with Sandra Bullock. So in that one, you know, the romance is between so she's got a guy that she already fancies. He gets hurt. I think he nearly gets hit by a train, doesn't he? He ends up in the hospital
Like that,
anyway.
yeah. He's in a coma, yeah.
Yeah, he's in a coma, and it's a misunderstanding. Sorry, it's a misunderstanding. It's a misunderstanding. Sorry, it's my mum turned up. So, it's a misunderstanding, and she says, "Oh, I was going to marry him." Then all the family thinks that she was engaged to this guy, but actually, the romance is between her and Bill Pullman, who plays the brother. And he it kind of creates conflict. I apologize. It kind of creates this conflict between the you know, she's living a lie. I apologize for that. Lots of background noise going on. I'll mute for a minute.
Yeah. We can go back to the point, but the point is there's the conflict in that is we have the external conflict, of course, of the misunderstanding, and then eventually the brother is the one she falls in love with is like suspicious of her at first, even because like, wait a second, we've never heard him talk about you, that sort of stuff. So While You Were Sleeping is a great example of the fact that, you know, it's not uncommon for people who don't read romance to come in thinking, oh, this is all going to be about two people falling in love. There's no plot. And the answer is no. I mean, you could argue that Star Wars is a romance because of the
Good actually.
Yeah, because of the eventual trajectory for, admittedly, not technically the main character, is to fall in love, you know. But I'd probably call that a strong romantic subplot because it is mostly because of the marketing term. Anyway, if anyone has anything else to say, sorry, I'm not really trying not to monopolize, but could probably
You're good.
move on.
Yeah. We might as well ask the question now. And for romance, obviously, we want, you know, everybody's pretty sure what romance is, not that, but what about like heat levels? And you want to talk about Like
Yes.
level can do romance books and stuff.
Sure. So, depending on who you're talking to, there's some people who think that romance equals books with lots of sex in them. Technically speaking, there is a genre with books with lots of sex in them, and that's erotica. But and then there's several different levels of how erotica, where the plot is the sex, kind of integrates into romance. But generally speaking, a romance doesn't have to have any sex in it at all. I know May Margaret's going to want to talk about that, so I'm going to
Yeah.
skip and talk about the higher ends. So when you're reading, for example, historical romance that is extremely mainstream, like Bridgerton, that is that the Avon romances had a very specific feel and a very specific amount of sex that was expected in them. But even not every Avon romance at the time. There's Edith Layton published a whole bunch of books that are all closed door, and they're all very lovely romances. But yeah, is there an expectation of it? Yes, but that's based on the publisher, the cover, the author, several other things. It's not extremely based on the subgenre necessarily. So, May Margaret, what do we got for the other end of the spectrum?
So I'm very I don't like to use the word clean because that implies that the other end is somehow dirty, which is incorrect. It's more just low heat. I do very more on the purely emotional side with the feelings, and it kind of builds up to a kiss at the end, or a marriage at the end. So mine's very, very low heat. But then you have to look at the plot points. So in a story where the end result is that they have sex, your midpoint might be that they kiss. Or in a story where they're always having sex, your end point might be they decide to commit to a life together, or whatever it might be. But when you're making it clear that you're not intending to have sex on the page, then it's much slower, I think, like physically, and it's more about the real subtle touches. So the midpoint might be that they actually hold hands, and they probably don't really get together until quite late in the book. I'm tend to, the one I'm writing at the moment is someone who's pretending to be a debutante, and it's very low level. It's more kind of the glances and secretive touches and things like that. So yeah, that's completely acceptable as well. And it is about how you then market that. Michelle has a question.
Oh, all right. Yeah, it's hang on, let me open up the chat for a second. What are some ways to telegraph heat levels? I would say that the best way is like just kind of seeing, when you reach that, romantic tension point, like, when things are about to happen, like how far it goes, like kind of what language is being used. If it's using a lot of stuff you wouldn't hear on TV very often, you can probably expect that it's going to be like you're going to see or read a lot of very in-depth. Oh, early in the story. Never mind.
There's actually an answer to that. First of all, if you look at the category, like if you drill down into some of the things, for example, one other term for what May Margaret writes is traditional regency. And traditional regency is going to be, low heat level, no sex. It's going to be along the lines of Georgette Heyer or Jane Austen, right? And we can have the argument later about whether Jane Austen wrote romance novels or not, because that's not relevant here. But that's it. Like, they don't even kiss at the end of most of her books, right? So
Yeah.
that's a very specific heat level that a lot of readers are like, I really liked Cotillion, give me 55 more like that, and that's common. Couple ways. Okay, so you used to be able to tell 100% from the cover what the heat level is going to be. If the woman was like half naked on the front and the man was very like shirtless, 100% there'd be sex by the 60% mark, right? They don't do that anymore because there's so many covers that are like illustrated instead of by illustrated I mean like almost the cartoony style. The other things that you used to be able to tell was like if there's a dog on the cover, it's a romantic comedy. There's probably not that much sex. But these days they threw out all those cover rules because drawn covers are a little cheaper and easier than the other kind. So here's the other thing. It's a craft issue when you can't really tell how much sex there's going to be in the book because for example, if the book opens up and the lead female who is alone at the moment is talking about jumping into bed with her vibrator or something, then yes, there's going to be sex all over the place. But I've absolutely read a story where like this, and I loved the book otherwise, but the first half of it, there was all this like steamy physical tension where they just used words like, you know, that were very deep in the body. Like, you know, my, her skin was hungering and all that other kind of phraseology. And then at the 50% mark, it kind of cooled off and then turned into a slightly different story. And I'm like, that's a craft issue. The craft issue is 100%. You have to make it so that there's going to be like, if there's an expectation that is set that there is going to be a high heat level because the two people are basically drooling all over people at all times, and they have, again, like I said, a high awareness of each other's bodies and a high like when they describe how they feel about the other person, it's not like, oh, I really love that dress she's wearing or whatever. It's like, oh, I can see all the way down to her navel with the cleavage, you know, that sort of thing. If your descriptions get real sexual real early on in the book, then I'm expecting sex by the 33% mark, if not, you know, the 60% mark. I make jokes about that, but I used to be able to, if you bought an Avon romance between about 1998 and 2016-ish, somewhere in there, I used to be able to basically like flip the book open and be within like 3 or 4 pages where the sex scene was, the like big, all the violins sex scene, because they kind of had expectations, the editors did. Yeah, you're not wrong. So Michelle also said I would throw in how graphic other things are in the book, like violence. Let's just say I was a bit surprised by the last book I read, but it was done well. So yeah, if you've got a book that's maintaining a high level of tension in all of the plot, it would not be surprising to see a sex scene in there. But it is not required.
Yeah.
But also your blurb of your story, your back cover, but also should tip you off, like what sort of heat level you're going for, because you know, like a steamy kind of thing, or versus the cutesy, or kind of thing, right?
Yeah, you should absolutely try to telegraph that sort of thing in your blurb if you at all can. It gets a little squiffy in historical romance because unless you're writing like a story about a 1800s sex club or whatever, it's gonna, what your description is gonna sound kind of
yeah.
I could give you an example because I just remember writing the blurb for my story. It is 27,000 words, and there are, I think, 2,500 words of it is very, you know what's going on sex. There is no closed door. But my blurb is like, are they going to be able to build a life together and all this other stuff? And it's like, there's sometimes you just kind of have to. So like, again, with historical romance, if it says traditional on it anywhere, you probably don't want to expect quite as much sex. And sometimes the length can tell you. Not all is hard. Category romances did very much label their heat level. But like the really thin little Regencies are very unlikely to have sex. The thicker ones are much more likely.
Also, you're saying about the craft issue with, you know, make sure you telegraph it up in the first few pages. I think it's true the other way. You know, if I start off with kissing in the first few chapters, then the expectation is that by the end, the heat level will increase. So whatever you start with whatever you want to end the heat level with, you kind of have to work backwards. So if I want to end with they finally kiss, then I then have to think, well, what's before that, and work backwards. And if you want to end with, oh, they finally have sex, and you do the same thing, what's the stages beforehand? And so it might be that you reach those other bases quicker if you're, or you go further in if you're doing something that's more high heat level. Whereas, like I say, mine would be more, exchanging glances, and maybe at the midpoint they secretly hold hands. It's sort of a lot more cutesy, I want to say.
It's so much fun when you're writing something where you have to like intentionally keep them apart for so long. Like it's a real high level of skill if you can get them to like be close enough to each other that they can fall in love, but far enough apart that they don't actually get to like touch any more than, oh no, her skirts were brushing against his legs as they did the.
And that's, I have to say, I think that's where historical fiction works, because my other book's set in Victorian, and it was very much, in England at least, no for a woman and a man to be together in the same room. Like, that was scandalous. And so there's a lot more you can play around with things like that. Whereas when you're doing it in modern day, there's a lot more things that are allowed. So I would say it's probably, I wouldn't say it's impossible, but I'd say it's harder to write lower heat in modern day. At least I think so, unless you're doing lower YA or something like that.
And another thing that will often have lower heat is something with a strong other plot.
Oh yes, yeah.
So, like, if the two people meet, and just to use an extremely silly example, while dog walking because their dogs like go around them in circles and the leashes tie them together, that's often another sign that there's not going to be a lot of high heat, because it is concentrating more on humor. Now, there's obviously rom-coms written by a lot of authors, especially recently, that do have high levels of humor and high levels of heat, but humor is kind of a tension diffuser in a lot of cases. So it's going to be real hard to maintain the super high level of tension necessary to get them into bed by the 33% mark. If they're just laughing the whole time, unless again that's part of the comedy, in which case you've got a sex comedy, which is
interesting,
or a sex sex farce, because you're writing noises off or whatever, but that's completely different. Sorry. Anyone have anything else to add, or we can move on?
Okay, I think we'll move on then. So while you're talking about how like all these heat levels and all that, it also leads to the question of, you want this romance and this story and your plot to be compelling. Then, so how do you create that compelling romance plot?
Conflict, for one thing. Conflict is absolutely essential. So you can either do an enemies to lovers trope, where they absolutely hate each other to begin with, and you're wondering how on earth will these people get together, or you can do a love at first sight, but they're kept apart for some reason, usually some kind of antagonistic force. So again, I'm talking historical because that's what I know, but you might have it that the person that she's fallen in love with is already betrothed to someone else, or in my case they want him, and so they're the ones that expose her for not being a real debutante. And then you look at other genres, it could be things like it's war that has kept them apart, or in the film Passengers, it's there's a mystery of why they're the only two that's woken up. So you have got this thing of every book's a mystery. So If we don't know much about the love interest, maybe he's mysterious. In Notting Hill, it's the fact that she's a famous actress, and suddenly the guy's put in the limelight that's keeping them apart. But basically, it comes down to conflict, and you need to decide. Obviously, they're going to be together at the end, but you need to decide at the beginning: do they like each other? Because if they like each other, then you need something external that's going to stop them getting together. Or you can do the classic enemies to lovers or mistaken, identity. So like, while you're sleeping is a mistaken identity, in the sense of the one that she's supposed to be going to marry isn't the one she falls in love with. So that's a conflict, some sort of triangle, but it's all conflict at the end of the day. Just
And there's always has to be multiple layers of conflict. Like the external conflict is either going to be, well, there's only 4 kinds of external conflict, but you can do character versus character, that'd be your enemies to lovers. Characters together versus an outside source, so that would be like to use the sorry, the outside source would be like they're currently fighting a dragon or something like that. Like lovers together against the plot is a really good way to write a romance in a lot of cases, and that's one that allows them to get together a little earlier, but it keeps them apart because, oh no, they have to fight the dragon or whatever, right? Or get out of the tree, I think is the typical thing, or to save the cat. I guess I could go with that, but there's a secondary plot that's usually very strong. If you were writing like the purest of romances, that would be mostly an internal conflict. So a really and you have to include these in all of them because the character has to go through some sort of internal arc, but that conflict is usually going to be something along the lines of, I don't deserve this other person, or I have this big terrible thing that happened to me in the past, and because of that it is impossible for me to fall in love, or I am too busy with my career and I don't have time to fall in love. But all of these internal conflicts, like you don't have to, like, enemies to lovers, like literally hate the other person because of well, I mean, with enemies to lovers, usually there is some sort of massive external conflict between the people, right? But another way to have the two people mad at each other, I guess, in a way that isn't quite as two-sided, would be if one of them is like, oh, I cannot possibly date you. You look like my dead husband or whatever. You know what I mean? Like there's so yeah, those are the kind of basic.
There's also when they're both on like opposing, they're both good, but they're both on opposing sides of some kind of thought process. Can't remember what it's called, but I remember there being a romance that was a guy who owned a bookshop, and the woman was working for some big corporate company that planned to buy him out or demolish it or something. And basically,
you've got mail, but
yeah.
So that would be and like specifically in that one, that also had a case of mistaken identity smashed on top of it, which you don't have to have, but it's really nice when you do. With if you are writing specifically a very strong romantic subplot, like one that has the same, they meet, they fall in love, they can't be together for some reason, they are finally together, that basic plot arc. If you're doing that in a strong romantic subplot in something that is not otherwise a romance, because again, they're fighting the dragon, but the focus is really on the fighting of the dragon or something, then you do have a little more leeway. But the main reason you have a little more leeway is because you don't have the time on page. I mean, I guess you could write like a 600-page book and have 300 pages of romance and 300 pages of fighting the dragon, but that's going to be a little unbalanced. But if you don't have as much time to show the romance, you kind of sometimes have to do it sped up a little bit. So then you don't have as much time to get into all of the internal conflicts because you don't really need quite as many of them because you've got the dragon.
I have to know Shrek or something. I don't know.
Yeah.
Yeah, that.
Cool. Does anybody have anything else to add before we move on? Next question.
I'm really sorry. I kind of do.
That's
So
fine.
you know how there's all sorts of craft books for non-romance authors about how to craft a plot and everything. There's one major one for romance authors that's called Romancing the Beat.
I'm glad you mentioned that. Yeah, go
Yeah.
ahead.
If you don't want to pay the like $6 to buy the book, which you should pay $6 to buy the book, it's not very long. She has like a beat sheet that you can download if you join her mailing list. It's and she breaks it down a lot into like 20 or 25 separate plot beats that you could have. And she points in there, you don't need all of them. You can combine some of them. You can like shorten some of them, but basically these are the ones that they're expected that you're going to go through, and they kind of reflect this similar plot to like the hero's journey or whatever, because they meet, they're like, oh no, we can't be together for whatever reason. They start moving together. There's more conflict building up around them. There's the Dark Night of the Soul happens in there when they do like the third act breakup and all that other stuff. But yes, Romancing the Beat, it's by Gwen something or other. Let me look up her name.
I definitely recommend it. I came from film background, and I was quite overwhelmed to begin with on, okay, where do I begin? And someone recommended the book to me, and it's fantastic because it's using beats that you would naturally have in a story anyway. Like, it's not revolutionizing what a story is,
Right.
but it's showing specifically how to use those beats to create the best type of romance, and for any heat level as well. Like, it's a generic beat. It's up to you how you interpret that for your heat level.
Yeah, I think I might need to pick that up.
It's super useful. Like I said, if you just want the taste, I put the website link in the chat, and she talks about it on there, and then you can go and dig into her stuff and figure out what's if you need anything more than the beat sheet. There's also a Scrivener template if you're that sort of person. So we have a lot more things to get to and not as much time as expected. So let's try to move.
That's fine. Okay, cool. So how do you, let's go to, okay. So with I think you covered a little bit of how to with your stuff. Sorry, I'm just reading these notes again. Okay.
I'm really sorry.
How do you include like emotional depth in your thing? Or I know sometimes especially with maybe you're going more on the erotica side, you're not going to have as much, or versus some of the stuff that you do. So how do you decide that, and how do you include it?
I think it's kind of a misnomer to say that there's not as much emotional depth in erotica.
Yeah, some people say that.
Yeah, they absolutely do. I've heard that, because it's like, oh well, you don't. Nobody has any feelings. They're just having sex all the time. And if your sex scene doesn't advance the plot, if your sex scene doesn't advance the emotional plot of the book, it also is possible that your sex scene would advance the action plot, but we'll set that aside. But if you're then you might as well write a short story. I mean, like there are entire genres where you can write kind of meaningless sex, right? But if you're writing something that is romance, is under the romance umbrella, then your sex scene has to advance the plot. But how to put more emotion into your story is actually where we were going with. Sorry for the digression. There are so one of the ways okay, there's two answers to this question. One of them is like there are two kinds of answers. There's the craft answers to this, like how do you get more like how do you get more of the emotion that you know the characters are feeling on the page? And then there's like the prep work side of it, which is also craft, but it's less on the word level. And the first thing you have to do is know you don't have to feel the same feelings as your characters, but you have to know what they're feeling. And if you and this doesn't mean that if you have, I don't remember what the word is, but the thing where you have a really horrible time describing emotions, it doesn't mean you can't be a romance novelist if you have that. All you have to do is get out one of those like feelings wheels and go through and go, wait a second, that's the one that makes sense. So
Can I add to that, just because that is something I struggle with?
yeah.
So I struggle. I can feel the feelings of my characters, but I personally struggle with how to explain it. So the first thing I do is when I'm writing my first draft is I don't worry about it, because it can be overwhelming for worrying about too much. I just literally write down what they're feeling, which is bad practice for editing. But when it comes to editing, that's when I'll go through and I'll get it's a book called The Emotional Thesaurus, and basically I'll use that to then help with, okay, how does that demonstrate? How will they look? How will they behave? What's going on inside their body if it's from their point of view? So I'll kind of know. So in my first draft, I know that I'm going to put feeling into it. I'll just do a bit of telling in my first draft. So it's not that I'm ignoring feeling, I'm just knowing I've got to explain it properly. So just because you said about that, so I actually have the thing where I struggle to describe the feelings. But I also know it needs to be there. So it's almost like an arrow of, she feels angry. Now I'm going to explore that.
Yeah. And to go to the other side, like how do you make the feelings pop off the page more? How do you make them? The first thing you do is deepen your point of view. The visual industry term is deep POV. But basically what you're doing there is you're getting rid of the filter words. So example, you could say something like she felt like her heart was about to explode, right? Well, if you get rid of the words she felt, all of a sudden you're just left with, her heart was about to explode, which again, hopefully not literally, different kind of book if it is. You can have a lot of little things like that. Another very silly one is the less often you use their name, the more it feels like you're in the character's point of view. And yes, obviously there's a lot of romance, especially contemporary rom-com, that's written in first person, but you even need to deepen your first person, because the difference between I felt like my heart is going to explode and my heart was going to explode is surprisingly huge.
Yeah. And again, that's an editing stage thing, but absolutely something to keep in mind. I'll often go through the manuscript and get it to highlight all of those keywords, felt or heard, and then decide, is there a better way to write this that deepens the point of view more? And I think for romance, it's probably, well, certainly as important with other genres, but I think in some ways more important, because similar to how horror is dealing with the emotion of fear, romance is dealing with the emotion of love. So that emotional resonance, I think, is important. And Stephanie was talking about that within an erotica book. I think it's actually almost more essential that you have an emotional connection within a book like that, because it's what brings it to life. It's not just a gimmick then, you're not just like, oh, I'm writing about loads of sex. Like, it actually brings it to life.
Yeah, absolutely. Gray, you had anything to add, or?
You guys have pretty much covered everything I was gonna say, so I think I'm good.
Sorry.
So I'm actually going to ask Gray this question, so he actually has a chance to say something. So yes. So what would you say probably your biggest frustrations or common errors that you see in romance.
Common error. I kind of feel like it's when a lot of people try to romanticize a lot of these really toxic behaviors in romance, like both on the page and on the screen. Like, for example, the person who would go after someone who is clearly not good for them at all. It's like, or some people try to romanticize like incestuous relationships, which is kind of like ew. Any description of Stockholm syndrome at all is just I don't even know why you're doing this. And hang on, what was the other part of the question? You said errors, but what else was it? Frustrations?
Yeah.
I don't know. I guess those are kind of the same thing. Yeah, sorry, I don't talk a whole lot whenever I do talk, so
That's
I
fine.
give pretty short answers, as people know.
That's fine.
Mafia romances. I mean, mafia can be cool, but you know, like I said,
That's fine. Anybody else to add to that?
To be honest, I really deeply want to defend dark romance, but it's not my genre. Like, you know, I've read a few, and I'm like, you know what, these books are not necessarily for me. But I know, not that, like 2 weeks ago or something, I went to interview the people who just started a romance bookstore a few months ago in Minneapolis. I'm in the Twin Cities, so I didn't have to go that far. And they have you know, they'd set up the store with like certain sections and everything, and they were like, well, this is going to be perfect, we don't have to worry about it. And then like 2 weeks in, they realized that they just simply did not have enough space for all of the dark romance, like in order to keep enough of dark romance in stock that they can make it through more than a weekend. So they had to like swap them out. And when you go looking through the store, it's so easy to see the dark romance section because all the spines are black. And it's very funny when you look at like some of the pictures that my editor, who is also a photographer, took of the actual bookstore, because it's like, you know, bright colors, muted colors in the romantasy, because they tend to have like more jewel tones, and then all of a sudden black, nothing but black. all of them were black.
wow.
And I talked with their dark romance expert, and I don't get the appeal, but so many people do. And the ability to write a story that starts out with somebody who is, I don't know, a serial killer, a murderer for the mafia, all these terrible things, and still does terrible things, and actually pull off something like a romance that is believable for people who aren't me. Again, I think that requires a high level of skill, but it's so definitely not for everybody.
Yeah. And on the topic of toxic things, this is just a plea when it comes to thick-lit or representation of disabled people, because it's very prevalent in YA romances in particular. Please don't make it out that someone who's disabled is somehow not worthy of romance, or is better off dead, or all of those types of things. You can have a journey where they think that when they first become disabled, but they need to be, you know, it's portraying the happily ever after is that they die and they're at peace is not representative of a good representation of disabled people. And I see it a lot in that sick lit, that's romantic sick literature. So it's just, and I'm saying that as a disabled and chronically ill person. So
and yeah, oh, sorry, I didn't mean to interrupt.
Go for it. And
yeah, Amanda makes a good point. Looking for something like that in real life, it's like, I'm really sorry to break it to you, but the super hot Yakuza is not going to change his ways for you. He's probably just going to use you. I'm sorry.
Yeah, at some point you do have to trust the reader, and when the readers are adults, when they're under 18, that is very different. But I mean, the problem with YA is that the majority of consumers of YA are unfortunately not YAs; they're adults.
Yeah.
So it gets a little weird in there depending on who your actual audience is, and if you assume your audience is adults, which you probably shouldn't, then what you write is, you know, whatever. But yeah, this whole thing, like, adults are allowed to decide what adults are going to read. Ideally, they would ideally adults are mature enough to take away. But I mean, even like the romance novels that all romance novels have some element of unreality to them, right? If you want like a super realistic romance, it's just not going to be quite as interesting. But you do kind of have to trust the reader not to take what you're writing and go, oh, this is absolutely 100% real life. Right.
Yeah, that's not
On
happening.
the other hand, I mean, as much as that would be great.
Can I just, as you mentioned that, go back to a previous question about genre expectations with historic romance? Just because you mentioned about romance is not real life. So there's this thought that you need to make your historical romances historically accurate and realistic. And it's not so much that, because it's not very realistic that the lowest debutante gets to marry the duke. You know, that's never happened. But it needs to have plausibility and feel real, and that's the same across all romantic genres. It just needs to have that plausibility that it feels like it could happen in that world.
Yeah, it's
Yep.
kind of that hopefulness, you know, the rising above societal expectations, right?
Yeah.
The thing about the dukes is there's only so many dukes that have ever lived in England.
Oh, I know.
and you could probably find more dukes than ever lived in England in one author's
Yes.
catalog, especially if the author is like Victoria Alexander and extremely prolific. But you know, and also if you Google pictures of dukes, they are not young and sexy, because as it turns out, there's only one way to get a title, a duchy, and that is when your dad dies. And surprisingly, even in the 1800s, if somebody was wealthy, they might live until they were 70, 80, or 90. And if they had a kid at 30, that kid's going to be 50 when he gets the title.
Yes.
Sorry.
Yeah.
And this is unfortunately true about Viscounts as well.
and also just in general, I mean, I know a lot about the kind of like aristocracy of England. So with that, you also get things like they seem to have dukes doing things that they wouldn't actually do. I'm just trying to think examples. I mean,
go off to war, for example.
Well, yeah,
they don't let you do that. Sorry.
No, but it's the fantasy of it. So when people say that they want historical fiction to be realistic, you need to know things. So you need to know, for example, one thing that will take readers out of it is if you have a duke and you have someone refer to them as my lord. It's like, no, it's your grace for a duke, and every other nobility, every other level of nobility is my lord. You need to know, if you're going to do that, you need to know what the hierarchy is, what the what viscounts are, the fact that there is no such thing as lords in the nobility system. That's like how you address them. You need to know all of those things, and you need to know the laws of the land, and you need to know, how the debutantes would be and what time of year and where they would go, because all the readers know that, in the in the Victorian era, I actually forget which way around it is. I think it's the Victorian era, the place to go is Green Park, and in the Regency era, which only spanned about 20 years, by the way. It was St. James's Park. I can't remember which way around it is. You need to check that, but you do need to check
think you're
things like
right.
that. Yeah.
My favorite story about this is Eloisa James, who I want to point out is an extremely accomplished Shakespearean scholar in her day life. And her parents are both massive award-winning author, poet sort of thing. So like she is as far up as the literati gets for romance novel authors, basically. And in her first book, she had a guy wearing pajamas to bed in the early 1800s. And she got so absolutely roasted for that because
Yeah.
pajamas, first of all, the word pajama probably hadn't made it over to England by 1800 yet because
Yeah.
it is from it's a I don't remember which Indian languages, I'm sorry, but it's a word from India. And second, they didn't actually start wearing pajamas until like late Victorian. So
Yeah, exactly. So it's little things like that. But on the same coin, or on the other side of the same coin, if you've done your research and you want to include something for story reasons that wouldn't happen. So my whole story, the whole basis of it is that a servant girl takes the place of a debutante in her household and pretends to be this person, and that would never happen. And of course it's revealed who she is and the Duke marries her anyway. There's no way that would be allowed to happen, but that's the fantasy of the story, so that you can break. But
yes.
I had to do a lot of research into, I was going to have her be arrested, but the time period I'm setting in, there wasn't a police force like we
No
have
Bow
now.
Street Runners yet, yeah.
So, you know, it's the kind of, that's the kind of thing you got to know it, and you can break certain rules.
Yeah, we are. Yes. Pizza Dragon's making fun of me a little in the comments. I get it. But here's the thing. If you read a lot of historical romance, a lot of times they have like an afterword where they explain everything that they broke in order to make this work. And then they'll explain, look, here's this thing. And it's like Tiffany problem land. This is this thing that you did not think was accurate. But by the way, we found a situation where it absolutely would have happened. And those are some of my favorite notes in the history of existence. They're just so good.
Yeah,
For
that's
those that, for those that don't know, explain the Tiffany thing. I know, but it's really funny. I love it.
So the Tiffany problem is something that I think Terry Pratchett said, which is he had a character named Tiffany. And like, if you're my age, you absolutely associate the name with Tiffany with the 1980s. And you may have thought that the name Tiffany just appeared in the 1980s, but actually, if you go back through historical records, it would be completely accurate for somebody born in the 1100s to be named Tiffany and her husband to be named Chad. So the Tiffany problem is if you name a character Tiffany in the 1800s, and Tiffany was probably a nickname for Theophania, which is Theophania, in case you were wondering. So if you name a character Tiffany and the story is set in the 1100s, you're gonna have to do a lot of tap dancing to get people to understand that that's actually real. So it's one of those things where there are things that people we all believe that are absolutely historically inaccurate. And one of those is the fact that the name Tiffany apparently just came out of nowhere in the 1980s. And the answer is no, it's a very old name. We are very deep in our time slot.
We're a little over.
I think if you guys have, and just like maybe each of you can maybe speak one last thing of advice or a tip or whatever, that would be great. Great. Do you want to add one last thing, tidbit?
I would say like when you're gonna write a romance, I think paramount is when it comes to the characters, write the good character first and then the romance, because like if this person doesn't have any sort of like compelling story, it's like, okay, why do I care about who you get with? But like if you have like a good character, a good backstory, a good reason for them to be in the plot, then it works out really well. Like an example I have is currently there's a project I'm doing. I'm calling it Tales of Defiance. There's a knight who's named Karina, and she is tracking down this thief named Asher, and the two sort of like they bounce off of each other really well as they eventually have to travel together, and it creates this dynamic of the thief is kind of showing the knight, hey, not everything is black and white. There are some times where you have to bend the rules because the rules sometimes hurt other people who can't follow the rules. And then the thief is like, hey, there are times when my nonsense is actually making things worse. And so these characters bounce off of each other, and eventually they start changing one another. And it's a good romantic subplot that readers would probably follow. So yeah, right. The good character first, and then the romance, I think, is just my formula, I guess.
No, that's great. That's actually a really good. People should absolutely do that. You need good characters, make a good story. Anybody else? Well, we have literally like 1 minute.
I was just going to say, we briefly touched on genre expectations of romance as a whole, but each subplot has its own genre expectations. So one of the most important things is to read the genre that you want to write, get a handle of what your audience is looking for.
Perfect. Stephanie, do you have anything else to add?
That was absolutely what I was going to say, me,
Sorry.
Margaret. So that's perfect. You got to read in your subgenre. You have to read extensively, even if you think, well, no, if you think everything sucks in your subgenre, then you probably shouldn't be writing that. But I can end by answering Mika's last question, which is, how important do you think it is to decide if it's a romance with a capital R before you write your first draft? I don't think it's important. Sorry. I don't think it's that important, but if you find yourself tending that direction, I would probably go looking for some romance resources before you start doing your editing. If you do decide, it's probably going to make life easier if you decide what you're writing is a romance with a capital R, a genre romance, before you write your first draft, because that gives you like a set of guide rails that you can put yourself on. And it, like I said, it'll make things easier for you, but it's never the only thing you have to do. It's never the only way to go about doing it. I thought what I was writing right now was a political fantasy. And then I was like, oh, shoot, here's this love interest out of nowhere. So, yeah. So well, anyway.
Thank you so much, guys, for your time and advice. And it was a very fun panel. I enjoyed listening to it. And I appreciate it. For those of you who are published, you can absolutely drop your books in our vendor hall, so you can, find more of your books. That was amazing. And I will stop the recording here as well. So thank you again. Have a great rest of the day.
Yep.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Good luck with the rest of your